The dust swirled through the Oklahoma State Fair auction barn as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the metal roof. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the packed arena where ranchers from across the Great Plains had gathered for the annual livestock sale. Cowboys in worn Wranglers and weathered Stetsons filled the wooden bleachers, their eyes sharp and calculating as prize cattle paraded through the ring. Jake Thompson sat in the back row, his calloused hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee from the concession stand. He'd driven 3 hours from his small ranch outside Tulsa, not to buy anything, but to support his neighbor who was selling some of his herd. The Morrison family had been ranching in Oklahoma for 4 generations, and Jake respected the old-timers' judgment about livestock. The Oklahoma heat was stifling even with the industrial fans running at full speed. Jake watched as Angus bulls worth $50,000 each sold to buyers from prestigious ranches in Texas and Montana. These were the genetic elite, animals whose bloodlines could be traced back decades, each with registration papers worth more than most people's cars. As the day wore on, the quality of animals began to decline. The prime breeding stock had sold early, fetching top dollar from wealthy ranchers with deep pockets. Now they were down to the final lots, mostly older animals or those with minor defects that the big operations wouldn't touch. "Last lot of the day, folks," the auctioneer announced, mopping sweat from his forehead with a red bandana. "Adult bull, no papers, been through some hard times. Let's start the bidding at $200. The bull that stumbled into the ring was a heartbreaking sight. His ribs showed through patchy hide, open sores dotted his flanks, and his once proud head hung low with exhaustion. Several ranchers actually laughed, and Jake heard one young cowboy from a big Dallas operation mutter, "That thing ain't even worth hamburger meat." But something in the bull's eyes caught Jake's attention. Despite the obvious suffering, there was still a spark there, a defiant dignity that reminded him of his father during those final days in the Tulsa hospital. The animal's breathing was labored, but he stood on trembling legs, refusing to give up completely. "200, anybody? How about 150? The auctioneer's voice carried less enthusiasm now. "This old boy's heading straight to the processing plant if nobody speaks up. Last call, folks." Jake found himself standing before he'd made the conscious decision to do so. His heart pounded as memories of his father's last words echoed in his mind. "Son, sometimes the things that look most broken are just waiting for someone to see their true value." 100, he called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet arena. Heads turned in his direction, some with surprise, others with amusement. The auctioneer seemed relieved to have any bid at all. 100 to the gentleman in the back. Going once, going twice, sold to buyer number 47. As Jake made his way down to complete the paperwork, he could hear whispers following him. "City boy doesn't know what he's doing," someone said. "Threw away good money on a walking death sentence," or another added. But Jake ignored them all. He'd grown up on a ranch outside Lawton, and he knew exactly what he was doing, even if he couldn't fully explain why. Loading the bull into his trailer was a challenge. The animal collapsed twice before they got him secured, and Jake's hired hand, Carlos, shook his head in disapproval. "Boss, that bull ain't gonna make it through the week," he said as they pulled out of the fairgrounds, passing beneath the famous Oklahoma State Fair entrance arch. Through his rearview mirror, Jake watched the bull struggling to stay upright in the trailer. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Interstate 44 as they headed home. "Maybe not," he said quietly, "but he deserves better than dying alone in some processing plant. If you've ever felt moved to help someone that everyone else had given up on, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of second chances and hidden treasures. Have you ever felt compelled to help someone or something that everyone else had given up on? What drives us to see potential where others see only problems?" Back at his ranch, 30 miles southeast of Tulsa, Jake carefully unloaded the bull into a small pasture he'd set aside away from his other cattle. The property sat on the historic Chisholm Trail, where countless cattle drives had passed through in the 1800s. The Cimarron River ran along the back of his land, providing fresh water, and century-old oak trees offered shade from the brutal Oklahoma sun. It was the quietest spot on his ranch, perfect for an animal that needed peace to heal. The bull, Jake had started calling him Thunder, after the Oklahoma City Thunder basketball team, could barely walk the 50 yards from the trailer to the water tank. Each step seemed to cost him tremendous effort, his hooves creating small clouds of red Oklahoma dust with every labored movement. But he kept moving forward with that same stubborn determination Jake had noticed at the auction. That evening, Jake called Doc Martinez, a veterinarian who'd been treating livestock in Creek County for over 30 years. Martinez had delivered calves for Jake's grandfather and had seen it all during his decades of practice, from the farm crisis of the 1980s to the modern industrial ranching operations that now dominated Oklahoma agriculture. When Doc Martinez arrived the next morning in his dusty pickup truck with the familiar vet cross painted on the doors, his weathered face showed skepticism. He'd driven past the gathering place in Tulsa and the Golden Driller statue, landmarks that reminded him how much Oklahoma had changed since he'd started practicing veterinary medicine. "Jake, son, I've known your family since before you were born," Doc Martinez said, examining Thunder with practiced hands. "Your granddad was one of the smartest cattlemen in Oklahoma, survived the Dust Bowl and everything that came after. He taught you well. But this bull," he shook his head, "severe malnutrition, parasites, infections in those wounds. I'm surprised he's still standing." Thunder stood motionless during the examination, only his heavy breathing indicating the effort it took to remain upright. When Doc Martinez checked his eyes with a small flashlight, the bull didn't flinch or try to pull away. His temperament remained gentle despite obvious pain. "He's got fight left in him," Jake said, running his hand gently along Thunder's neck. The bull's coat felt rough and patchy, but underneath Jake could feel solid bone structure. "Remember when everyone said that drought in '98 would finish us? You told my dad some of his cattle looked hopeless, but they pulled through. Sometimes things look worse than they really are." Doc Martinez prescribed antibiotics, deworming medication, and a special feed supplement designed for severely malnourished cattle. "I'll give you enough supplies for 2 weeks," he said, loading bottles and syringes into a metal box. "But Jake, don't get your hopes up too high. I've seen animals in this condition before. Some things are too broken to fix, no matter how much heart you put into it." For the next 10 days, Jake visited Thunder 3 times daily, driving out from his house past the old windmill his great-grandfather had built during the Depression. He administered medications, cleaned the wounds with betadine solution, and gradually increased the quality and quantity of feed. The routine became almost meditative. Morning treatments before sunrise, midday check-ins during the blazing Oklahoma heat, and evening care as the sun set over the prairie. Thunder's appetite slowly returned and the open sores began to close. Most importantly, Thunder started lifting his head when Jake approached, as if recognizing the man who'd saved him from certain death. On particularly hot days, Jake would sit under the oak trees and talk to Thunder about his plans for the ranch, his memories of his father, and his hopes for the future. On the 11th morning, Jake found Thunder standing by the fence, looking out toward the main pasture where the other cattle grazed. His ribs were still visible, but his coat had begun to show hints of its original deep brown color. When Jake opened the gate to bring fresh hay, Thunder actually took a few steps toward him instead of waiting passively. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake whispered, allowing himself the first real smile he'd had in weeks. "You're actually getting better, aren't you, boy?" That afternoon, while cleaning Thunder's water tank, Jake noticed something unusual in the bull's coat. As he brushed away dried mud from the animal's left shoulder, his fingers detected raised marks in the skin, too regular to be scars from injuries or fights. What do you think Jake discovered hidden beneath years of neglect and suffering? Have you ever found something valuable that others had thrown away or overlooked? Jake's discovery sent his heart racing as he carefully parted Thunder's coat to get a better look at the marks on his shoulder. What he'd initially thought might be old injury scars were actually numbers and letters, a registration tattoo that had been partially obscured by years of neglect and hair growth. The markings were faded but still legible under the Oklahoma sunlight. RWF 247. His hands trembling slightly, Jake took several photos with his phone, adjusting the angle to capture the clearest possible image of the mysterious markings. He'd heard stories from old-timers at the Stockyard City cattle auctions about legendary breeding bulls that had disappeared during ranch foreclosures, but he'd never imagined he might have stumbled onto one of these lost treasures. An hour later, Doc Martinez returned to the ranch, this time bringing his magnifying glass and a measuring tape. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, cleaning his glasses for a better look at the tattoo. "This is definitely a registration mark, but it's older than dirt. The style and numbering system dates back at least 15 to 20 years. Let me make some calls to the breed registries." While they waited for information, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled onto something significant. He researched cattle tattoo systems on his computer, learning how different ranches and breeding operations mark their animals. The RWF prefix suggested a specific ranch or breeding program, but finding the records would require connections Doc Martinez had built over decades in the veterinary field. Thunder seemed oblivious to the excitement his hidden marking had generated. He continued grazing peacefully, occasionally lifting his massive head to observe Jake and Doc Martinez with what seemed like mild curiosity. His recovery was becoming more apparent each day. His breathing had normalized, his appetite was strong, and he'd begun interacting with the other cattle across the fence line. That evening, Doc Martinez called with news that would change everything. "Jake, you need to sit down for this," he said, his voice carrying an excitement Jake had never heard before. "I sent those photos to my friend at the American Angus Association headquarters in Missouri. That tattoo belongs to Red Wolf Farm out of Montana, one of the most prestigious breeding operations in the country before they went under during the agricultural crisis." Jake sank into his kitchen chair, looking out the window where Thunder grazed peacefully under the security lights he'd installed around the pasture. The Oklahoma night was clear, stars visible despite the distant glow from Tulsa's skyline. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means you didn't just save any bull, son. According to their records, 247 Rwandan Franks was registered as Thunder Ridge, a championship bloodline bull who sired some of the most valuable cattle in North America before he disappeared during a ranch bankruptcy 15 years ago. Everyone in the industry assumed he'd been sold to a processing plant along with the rest of the Red Wolf Farm herd." The magnitude of what Doc Martinez was saying slowly sank in. Jake had purchased what many had believed to be a worthless, dying animal for $100 at a county fair auction. But Thunder wasn't just any bull. He was genetic royalty in the cattle world, a living legend that top ranchers had given up for dead years ago. "Are you telling me this bull is actually valuable?" Jake asked, though part of him already knew the answer from the excitement in Doc Martinez's voice. "Jake, if this bull is who I think he is, and if he can fully recover his health, you're looking at an animal worth more than most people's houses. His offspring have sold for tens of thousands of dollars each at elite cattle sales in Denver and Kansas City. But more than that, his bloodline was thought to be lost forever when Red Wolf Farm collapsed." Doc Martinez continued explaining the significance of Thunder's heritage. Red Wolf Farm had been renowned for producing cattle with exceptional marbling, growth rates, and maternal instincts. Their breeding program had taken decades to develop, and when the ranch failed, the genetic lines were scattered or lost entirely. That night, Jake sat on his porch overlooking the pasture, where Thunder continued his slow but steady recovery. The bull had gained noticeable weight, his coat was filling in beautifully, and the spark in his eyes had grown brighter each day. But beyond any monetary value, Jake knew he'd saved something irreplaceable, a piece of American agricultural history that had nearly been lost forever. As he watched Thunder graze under the Oklahoma stars, with the sound of coyotes calling in the distance, Jake realized this was bigger than just one man saving one animal. This was about second chances, about hidden value in forgotten places, and about the wisdom of looking beyond surface appearances to see true worth. What would you do if you discovered something you'd saved out of compassion turned out to be incredibly valuable? Would it change how you felt about your act of kindness? 6 months after that life-changing phone call, Thunder had transformed into the magnificent animal he was always meant to be. His deep brown coat now gleamed in the Oklahoma sunlight, his massive frame filled out with muscle and power, and he carried himself with the regal bearing of a champion. Veterinarians who examined him declared his recovery nothing short of miraculous, comparing before and after photos that seemed to show two completely different animals. Word of Thunder's resurrection spread quickly through agricultural circles across the American Midwest and beyond. The story reached breeding operations from Montana to Florida, generating excitement in an industry that rarely saw such dramatic recoveries. Cattlemen drove from as far as Texas and Kansas just to see the legendary bull who'd risen from near death, many bringing their families to witness what they called a miracle on the prairie. The local newspaper, the Tulsa World, ran a front-page story titled, "From Death's Door to Dynasty, Oklahoma Rancher Saves Legendary Bull," complete with before and after photos and quotes from industry experts who confirmed Thunder's incredible pedigree. The story was picked up by agricultural publications nationwide, then by major news networks fascinated by the human interest angle. Jake's phone rang constantly with offers from wealthy ranchers and breeding operations. The highest bid came from a Texas billionaire who offered $400,000 cash. No questions asked, promising Thunder would live like royalty on a 1,000-acre ranch with climate-controlled barns and full-time veterinary staff. Other offers included breeding contracts worth millions of dollars over Thunder's remaining reproductive years. But despite the financial pressure of maintaining his modest ranch and the tempting offers that would solve his money problems forever, Jake politely declined every offer. "Thunder's not for sale," he told each caller, often while watching the bull graze contentedly in the same pasture where he'd nearly died. "He's earned his retirement here in Oklahoma, and this is where he'll stay." The decision wasn't purely sentimental, though Jake's attachment to Thunder was undeniable. He had discovered that Thunder's story resonated with people far beyond the cattle industry. Visitors came from across the country to see the bull who'd defied death, bringing their families to learn about second chances and the value of seeing potential where others see problems. Jake began offering educational tours of his ranch, telling Thunder's story to school groups, 4-H clubs, church organizations, and anyone who wanted to listen. Children especially loved hearing how kindness and persistence had saved a forgotten champion, often asking to pet Thunder's gentle nose or feed him treats. The modest tour fees helped Jake maintain his operation while sharing an important message about compassion and perseverance. The ranch began attracting visitors from unexpected places. Cancer survivors came to see Thunder as a symbol of recovery against impossible odds. Families dealing with their own challenges found inspiration in the story of redemption and second chances. Veterans struggling with readjustment issues often spent hours sitting quietly near Thunder's pasture, finding peace in the bull's calm presence. One warm spring morning, as Jake prepared Thunder's feed near the old oak trees by the Cimarron River, he reflected on how much both their lives had changed. The bull who'd once been hours from death now stood as a symbol of hope and redemption, his story inspiring thousands of people who'd read about him or visited the ranch. And Jake, who'd been struggling to keep his family's ranch afloat, had found purpose and financial stability through an act of simple kindness. Doc Martinez visited regularly, not just for veterinary care, but to marvel at what he called the greatest recovery I've witnessed in 40 years of practice. During one visit, he found Jake sitting on the fence, watching Thunder graze peacefully with a small herd of carefully selected cows Jake had chosen to keep the old bull company in his golden years. "You know," Doc said, climbing up to sit beside Jake, "a lot of folks thought you were crazy that day at the auction, spending money you couldn't afford on an animal everyone else had written off as worthless." Jake smiled, remembering the whispers and skeptical looks from that day at the Oklahoma State Fair. The same people who'd questioned his judgment now called him a genius for recognizing Thunder's hidden value. "Maybe I was a little crazy, but sometimes crazy is just another word for seeing something others miss." Thunder lifted his massive head and looked directly at the two men, as if he understood the conversation. In his eyes, Jake saw not just intelligence and strength, but gratitude, the deep recognition of one soul who'd been saved by another, and who'd returned the favor by giving his rescuer's life new meaning and purpose. As the sun set over the Oklahoma prairie, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that reflected off the Cimarron River, Jake knew he'd made the right choice that day at the auction. He hadn't just saved Thunder's life, he discovered that sometimes the most valuable things in life come disguised as problems nobody else wants to solve. The bull that everyone had dismissed as worthless had taught Jake, and everyone who heard his story, That true value isn't always visible on the surface. Sometimes it takes patience, faith, and a willingness to see potential where others see only problems. What broken or forgotten things in your own life might be hiding unexpected value? Sometimes the best investments we make aren't in things that look perfect, but in those that need someone to believe in their potential.